I will end here and pass the word to an artist, Alexandros Mistriotis, of this generation, to give us his perspectives on tomorrow. And thank you very much again for being here. It's really important for us. And enjoy yourselves as well.
Hello. Χαίρετε. Luckily enough, I'm not supposed to introduce myself. I was invited to welcome you in Athens, which is an honor, but it's also an awkward position. The question arises, from which position do I speak to you? Who am I? And by the way, who are you? That's your problem. And I think that my position is plainly two-folded. I'm an artist, and I am a citizen of this city, which means that I'm also a citizen of this language and of this Greek state.
Can you all hear?
So we're all gathered here in Athens. Athens is an invisible city. The reason why is because everybody thinks that they know what it's all about. Athens has occupied a symbolic field that it's supposed to be in the foundation of our contemporary world. And this is quite problematic, actually, because people are unable to see, to look, to listen to what is really happening. And not just now. It's been like this for more than 200 years. I will tell you a personal story. When I was living abroad, quite often people would realize that I was a stranger because of my accent. And they would ask me, where do you come from? And most of the time I would play with them the game, guess where do I come from? Most of the time they wouldn't even talk about Greece, even though I would try to guide them. I would tell them I come from a European country, I'm from the south, it's in the Mediterranean. They would mention Portugal, which is not in the Mediterranean. They would mention Turkey, they would mention Israel. Greece, most of the time, wasn't there. And it's not by accident. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason that is related to our impasse and that crisis, not the local, the Greek crisis, but the European one. But we'll try to start with something a little bit more precise, more localized, with Athens, Greece, and this state that we call Greek democracy. So there's been a glorification, an apotheosis of the classical Greek 7th century before Christ. When the Greek state was created, the excavations in the Acropolis threw away all the other archaeological strata, and they kept only the 5th century. All the rest was of no importance. Luckily enough, there were some wells where we found elements that could help us learn a little bit what happened to the Acropolis. But the Acropolis was supposed to be, because the identification was so strong, the place for the palace of the Bavarian king when he came. There's another thing which is really important, is to think that the first journal of the state of Greece was in Germany, in German and in Greek, because we had a Bavarian prince as a king. And then in the parliament, we had three parties that were named officially the Friends of France. Get in. The Friends of France, the Friends of England, and the Friends of Russia. Well, there were no Friends of Germany because they had the government. And there's another story that I find even more revealing. You've probably heard about Lord Elgin when he took the marbles from the Parthenon. Well, actually, one of the first things that he did when he took them home was to wash them well. Why? Because they were not white enough, because there were still paintings on them. And they were supposed to be white, because this was the idea that they had. Actually, in a peculiar way, I think that I, as a Greek, and the people that you will see in the streets, and you will try to understand what they're talking about, they're parts of the same body that has been washed and washed and washed, and it has been unable to fit in the ideas that others had about them. And they're condemned to fail again and again. Why is that important? Because this apotheosis has replaced the most important contribution of the Greek experiment. I'm talking about the ancient Greek experiment. Why that? Because we cannot understand anymore the fact that the most important thing was the failure. It was not about creating a knowledge that we can put into our pocket and into our universities. It was about a devastating experience that led almost to nothing. And I will come back to that. But it is really important because it is a tool of self-understanding. And it has been used in a really catastrophic way during the centuries. Even the colonialism was based on the fact that the European world was superior, and it was superior because it had something. And this something was this objectified knowledge that was related to the ancient world, not just the Greek one, but the Greek one was necessary as a founding moment. So right now, we should realize that instead of talking about a knowledge that we can keep in a pocket, put in a box or in a certificate, actually we're just, as everybody, hunted by questions. And we're desolated, and we're marching through a desert. And this is the best thing that can happen to us. So, let's go a little bit deeper. We could say that democracy, tragedy, and philosophy are related to the Athenian and the Greek experiment. It is important to put all three of them together, especially in that meeting, because if we take one of these three, the other two are losing their depth. If you take tragedy out of democracy, you don't realize the depth and the danger of the questions that existed at the time. If you take tragedy without philosophy, then you don't understand why this all happened. It just becomes a commodity, as it is most of the time in our days. I'm talking about theater and art. And if you take the political situation, the questions about democracy out of philosophy, then, and you don't realize that it responds to things that happen at the time, then it becomes just an academic toy. I'm talking about philosophy now. So, the most important thing, and I guess tragedy is the more subtle element in this puzzle, is the fact that tragedy is talking about our fragility. And fragility is something that we need to reconsider because it is our last hope against the temptation of totalitarian society. So, what happened at the time was that we started having a definition of man that was so complicated, that released so much energy, that this system, the society, and the definition of man became more and more unstable. So, the Greek world, at the end, was blown into pieces. And this was the most important accomplishment. It was the realization that man cannot fit in space and time. Man cannot fit in any description. Man cannot fit in any kind of system. And I would try to give you an example and talk about the end, actually, of the classical world. Most of the time we're talking about the Peloponnesian War. But I'd suggest an equally devastating moment, which is the Bacchantes of Euripides. So it is supposed to be the last tragedy of the last tragic poet. Well, that can be disputed, but it is true that it was one of the last. What happens in this tragedy, I will try to resume really fast, is that we have the young king of Thebes, which is Pentheus, which denies a new cult that is coming from the east, the cult of Dionysus. And he considers this as a fraud, as a superstition. When Dionysus comes, he tries to talk with him and see, and finally he doesn't manage to convince him. He doesn't try much though, and he's jailed. The god, which is, he presents himself as a man, and then we have the turning point of the play where the god gets out. He humiliates the king of the city. He takes them out in the woods, and he's dismembered, cut into pieces by the followers of Dionysus, and decapitated by his mother, that brings his head, without being unable to realize that she has killed her son, by thinking that it is the head of a lion. So the end is really brutal and ruthless. We could probably say that the god won, but actually, that's not true. What happened is that God and man in that play are completely devastated. The way that God is winning is so absolute, so ruthless, that finally we can see the doubts of this poet that was labeled as an atheist at the time, to show that there's a complete impasse, there's nothing left. And just to assure you that this is not my way to see things, the tradition says that Euripides died torn into pieces by two hungry dogs, and they were sent by Dionysus. So people at the time, they really knew what this was all about. So what happens is that finally what we have is just this desire to find justice, to find beauty, to find truth. And we're left with this knowledge that we will always be under the shadow of this monk, of this thirst, of this need. So, shyly enough, I've been already talking about the future. I'm already talking about tomorrow. I'm already talking about the temptations that we have and the things that actually we shouldn't do, we shouldn't embrace. And what is the most important element in our adventure coming? And Athens is an extremely fertile terrain for this endeavor. Well, actually, it is scary because it is not something that was chosen. It is something that is falling on the land. But it is localized, and the symbolic importance of this city now is huge. I've lived most of my life next to the Acropolis, and I really hated it. Now, I go out, I look at it and I think that it has a meaning, a new meaning. We have a reason to refer to the Acropolis now, because we know that the failure of our symbolic system and the reference that we have in modern democracies is really problematic. So, Athens is a battlefield, and it's a battlefield where people die every day, physically and psychologically. But we should not forget that a battlefield is also a meeting point. And it's up to us to change the dynamic. There is a test, and I wish that we will all have clarity of mind in order to see, strength in order to endure, and aptitude to embrace happiness when it comes, which is really difficult in our days. So, being here and talking about tomorrow obviously leads to the idea that the future, tomorrow, is not against yesterday, against the past. It doesn't ignore the present time. It's not just une fuite en avant. We're not just running away from our situation. And I think that we should remember that catastrophe, is a term that is coming from theater, and actually from tragedy. And it is not clear whether it is a moment of release or a moment of grief. It's the same thing as the word crisis. Crisis means judgment. So it's the moment that we are going to meet the truth that we live longing for, even though we don't have the courage to speak it out loud. So, trying to come a little bit closer to our reality, I would say that today there's a manque of equilibrium between. Excuse me, I haven't been looking at you all the time. So, I will try to. So, what is happening is that now we see that politics, economy, society, culture, they do not manage to mingle together. There's a problem in our symbolic structure, the meanings, the tools that we have in order to explain, in order to realize and decide afterwards, are broken. So we're in a period where we see the manifestation of a lack of meaning. A lack of meaning means that we have a legitimization problem as well, because we see that the institutions, they say things that they do not believe. And since this legitimization problem is getting bigger and bigger, and we didn't manage to solve them now, we have an even deeper problem, which is something that we could call in English a governmentability problem. Our societies seem to be more and more difficult to govern, to live together. And what does that mean? It means violence in all levels of society, but specifically state violence. Because when the state is not legitimized, when the state cannot govern, it will govern by power and violence. And this is exactly what is happening here in Greece. I really thought of showing you some pictures, but I think we're all fed up a little bit of that. But I assure you that the violence exists in all levels of communication, and the reality of the people is the reality that other countries are going to face really soon. And when a society is ailing, the laboratory of this pain is the body of artists. Purely, simply, really. It is in these bodies that we will see this absence, this need and this pain. And that means that tomorrow, this tomorrow, is exactly the moment for these artists that are going to come. And I really don't know in which generation I am. But I say this horrified, because when we say that this is the time of the artists, that means that it is the time of the death of these artists as well. And when I'm talking about death, I'm not only talking about this singer that died with a knife in his heart, literally. I'm also talking about all these others, nameless people, that will die drowning in their best hopes, in their deepest truth, abandoned, just giving their lives and their bodies and their time to prepare the other ones that will emerge and that will have a name and a face in our history. And art is a nonsense that becomes important because we insist. And it's through this insistence, it is our way to look at things and to preserve things that are neglected, that we make the definition of art even wider, more dangerous. So I think that we should ask questions. And these questions should be useless, actually, especially at this period, because there is a polarization, a really strong polarization. And the free space for people to think about things, to search in the gray areas, will be narrow and more narrow and more narrow, and the space that we will have in order to talk will be almost gone. So asking questions that nobody wants to ask will be one of the main functions that we have to protect, that we have to cultivate. The big question actually is the question of desire. What do we want? What is it that is sufficient for us in order to live? And what is it that we are dreaming? But I'm not talking about the dream as something. It is actually the fact that we have to bring back desire, not as a human right, but as a human reality that has been consumed and lost. But I will probably talk about that later. And I say that because the question of desire is really important, and now that there's so much repression, we will see the desire getting out in the streets. We will see the crowds cry out what they need and what they want. When we are talking about desire, we're not talking just about somebody wanting to do something with somebody else. We're talking about something that is unnameable. It's something that passes through the walls. And it's actually the most precious thing that we have. But I wanted to keep that for the end. So let's go back to art in order to finish my small speech. Small, I hope it was small. So art today, tomorrow, as yesterday, is supposed, it must cover, fill all these fields that have been left aside, especially in our times when the economy is having this tendency to obliterate all other questions. And since we cannot quantify things, they are condemned to vanish from our field, we cannot see them anymore. So I think that now culture and civilization is treated like a tool in order to commerce, or as a commodity in order to passer notre temps, for amusement. And it is ironic because this is the moment that we need it the most. So art is supposed to talk about the memory of the sacred, and it's supposed as well to talk about the memory of death that we cannot talk without grimace today. Art is supposed to talk about sexuality and this generalization, consuming spirit of bodily liquids. It is supposed to talk about the absurdity of this unjust world and the freedom of solidarity. It is supposed to talk about the failure of our common sense and all these truths that kept us asleep. It is supposed to talk about the notion of we, that thing that makes us be together and feel together, what is common, and what is personal as well. And it is supposed definitely to talk about the thirst for love, passion, eros, without end. All these things do exist. We're not here to bring them anew, but they're hidden into our flesh, vibrating every day. What we need to do is just give them some words, some images, and some sounds. So it is time for us to be exposed. It is time for us to say big words, like me here in front of you now. And we will be judged for them, like lovers. But we can talk at last. I think that we can talk more today than we could yesterday. And I think tomorrow it will be even more appropriate and sometimes easy to do so. And we can be happy because at least now things that they seem to be solved, they can be put out in the light of the day. We can even talk about love. We can talk about love, though, as an enigma, because love actually, it seems that it is not a sentiment, an emotion. It is more like an emotion that develops. It's an initiation that goes towards some kind of a knowledge. And it becomes transparent and light, and it surrounds everything at the end, and it becomes almost absent, strange. So, at the end, I would like to propose something really simple, because I guess there were some parts in my speech that were quite abstract. I think that we could try to evaluate all things that we do nowadays from three different points of view that are deeply interconnected. I think that the point of view of those who search beauty and the point of view of those who search for truth, and the third point of view of those who search for a moral value between what is good, what is bad, actually kindness. They're interrelated. And what happens is that finally, when we go deep into each one of these three ways, we see that they are becoming more and more united. It is impossible to have one thing, and there will be always a tension between these three qualities. But when we are in an impasse and we are trying to find a solution, we could change our point of view and see if we can find a different solution, a different description from one of the other two. In Greek language, there's a really funny thing. We have the words erotisi, which means question, and the word erotas, which doesn't mean what we say in English-speaking world, erotic and eros. It is a really confusing word that it is between love and passion, between mind and body, actually. It's an overwhelming need of the being. Why I say this? Έρωτας and ερώτηση, that are so close, they're not etymologically related. So the relation is even more profound. And why I say this? Because actually, all we have left is this value of the question. This is what is left to us. This is the only reference that we can count on. Things are getting difficult, more and more, every day. It is not clear whether darkness is obscure and if light is enlightening. We really don't know where we're heading. Tomorrow is a question. And for me, we could probably take this question as the quest of what is beauty, what is truth, and of what is kindness. Have a nice stay.